Imagine walking through the bustling marketplace of ancient Athens on a bright afternoon. The sun hangs high overhead, casting sharp shadows between the white marble columns and the crowded stalls where merchants hawk their wares. You weave between philosophers debating in their fine robes, politicians calculating their next moves, and citizens performing the elaborate rituals of civilized society. And then you see him. A man sits in a large ceramic jar, what the Greeks called a pithos, the kind used for storing grain or wine. But this jar has become his home. He owns nothing but a cloak wrapped around his weathered body and a wooden staff resting against the curve of his makeshift dwelling. His beard is wild and unkempt, his feet are bare and dirty, and in his hand, improbably, he holds a lamp, lit and glowing even though the sun blazes overhead with full intensity. You stop and stare. You cannot help yourself. Everyone stops and stares. Some laugh, some shake their heads in disgust, some whisper to their companions about the madman who has taken up residence in the agora. But the man seems utterly unconcerned with their reactions. He holds the lamp higher and peers into the faces of passers-by with an intensity that makes them uncomfortable. "What are you doing?" someone finally asks, unable to contain their curiosity mixed with contempt. The man looks directly at his questioner, his eyes sharp and penetrating despite his disheveled appearance. "I am looking for an honest man," he says simply, as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world. The crowd erupts. Some laugh at what they assume is a joke. Others feel the sting of insult. Still others sense something dangerous in this performance, something that challenges the very foundations of everything they take for granted about how life should be lived. This man sitting in a barrel with his absurd lamp is Diogenes of Sinope. And he is about to teach you that everything you believe about happiness, virtue, success, and the good life is probably wrong. We live in a world obsessed with accumulation. We chase money, possessions, status, reputation, and approval from others. We build elaborate lives filled with complexity, anxiety, and endless striving. We convince ourselves that happiness lies just beyond the next purchase, the next promotion, the next achievement. We worry constantly about what others think of us. We craft carefully curated versions of ourselves to present to the world. We follow rules we do not believe in and chase goals we do not truly want because society tells us this is how respectable people live. And then along comes this filthy man living in a jar who suggests that all of it, every single bit of it, is completely unnecessary. Diogenes was not just unusual or eccentric. He was not simply ahead of his time or misunderstood by his contemporaries. He was something far more radical and far more threatening. He was a man who looked at the entire edifice of civilized society, at everything that people in every culture and every era work so hard to build and maintain, and he said no. Not just no, but hell no. And then he proceeded to live his entire life as a walking demonstration that you do not need any of it to be happy, to be free, to be fully and authentically human. This is not just ancient history or philosophical curiosity. This is a direct assault on almost everything you've been taught about how to live. And the most disturbing thing about Diogenes is not that he was some crank spouting wild theories from the margins. The most disturbing thing is that he was right. Or at least, he was right enough that his example has haunted philosophy for over 2,000 years, challenging every generation to explain why we make our lives so complicated, when simplicity might be the key to everything we actually want. You are about to encounter ideas that will make you uncomfortable. You are going to meet a philosopher who defecated in public, who masturbated in the marketplace, who insulted the most powerful men of his time to their faces, and who rejected every social convention that makes civilized life possible. And the deeply unsettling thing you will discover is that his outrageous behavior was not random or attention-seeking. It was methodical. It was purposeful. It was philosophical. Every shocking act was a carefully aimed arrow shot at the heart of illusion and pretense. Diogenes called himself a cynic, from the Greek word for dog, because he believed human beings should live like dogs do, following their nature without shame or artifice. His contemporaries called him a dog as an insult. He accepted the label as a badge of honor. He barked at people who displeased him. He ate in the marketplace like a stray. He slept wherever he happened to be when exhaustion overtook him. And he claimed to be happier than any of the wealthy, respectable citizens who looked down on him with disgust. This is not a philosophy you can study from a comfortable distance. This is not an abstract theory you can discuss at dinner parties while changing nothing about your actual life. Diogenes demands something far more challenging. He demands that you look honestly at the gap between what you claim to value and how you actually live. He demands that you examine whether all your possessions and ambitions and social performances are bringing you genuine satisfaction, or whether they are just elaborate distractions from a life you are too afraid to actually live. The lamp he carried through the streets of Athens at midday was not a random prop. It was a philosophical statement. In the full light of day, in the supposed center of civilization and wisdom, he claimed he could not find an honest person. Everyone was playing a role. Everyone was pretending to be something they were not. Everyone was trapped in a cage of social expectations and conventional wisdom. Everyone except him. And this is where things get interesting. Because if Diogenes is even partially correct, if we really are trapped in elaborate performances that prevent us from living authentically and freely, then his example becomes more than just a curious historical footnote. It becomes a challenge. It becomes a question we have to answer for ourselves. Are you going to keep playing the game by rules you never agreed to, chasing goals you do not truly want, seeking approval from people whose opinions should not matter? Or are you going to do something different? Now, let me be clear from the beginning. This is not going to be a comfortable journey. Diogenes was not comfortable. He did not make others comfortable. His philosophy is not designed to help you succeed at the game of modern life. It is designed to make you question whether the game is worth playing at all. It is designed to strip away your illusions, challenge your assumptions, and potentially turn your entire understanding of the good life upside down. Some of what you hear will sound completely insane. Some of it will sound impossible to apply to modern life. Some of it will probably offend your sensibilities and violate your sense of how civilized people should behave. Good. That means it is working. That means you are actually encountering the real Diogenes, not some sanitized version packaged for easy consumption. Because here is what you need to understand before we go any further. Diogenes was not trying to be liked. He was not trying to be popular. He was not trying to found a school or build a following or create a legacy. He was trying to be free. And he discovered that genuine freedom requires giving up almost everything that people normally consider valuable. It requires letting go of your reputation, your possessions, your plans, your need for approval, and your fear of what others think. It requires living so simply, so honestly, so directly, that nothing and no one has power over you. This is terrifying to most people. It was terrifying in ancient Athens, and it is terrifying now. Because if Diogenes is right, then you have been wasting your life pursuing things that cannot give you what you actually want. You have been enslaving yourself to possessions that own you more than you own them. You have been performing for an audience whose applause means nothing. You have been building a life that looks good from the outside but feels hollow from the inside. And the solution Diogenes offers is not some complex philosophical system or elaborate practice. The solution is devastatingly simple. Stop. Stop accumulating. Stop performing. Stop pretending. Stop doing things you do not believe in to impress people you do not respect in order to achieve goals you do not actually want. just stop. And then see what remains. See what you actually need. See what actually makes you happy. See what actually matters when you strip away everything else. This sounds simple. It is not. It might be the hardest thing you ever attempt. Because everything in your culture, everything in your upbringing, everything in your education has trained you to do the exact opposite. You have been taught to want more, to need more, to be more. You have been taught that success means accumulation, that happiness requires the right circumstances, that freedom comes from having enough money to do what you want. Diogenes says all of that is backwards. He says real freedom comes from needing nothing. Real happiness comes from wanting nothing. Real success is not having what you want, but not wanting what you do not have. Consider this: a man in a barrel, holding a lamp in bright daylight, searching for something everyone claims to be, but almost no one actually is: honest, free, authentic, real. And consider the possibility, just the possibility, that this apparently insane beggar understood something about human flourishing that our sophisticated modern world has completely forgotten. The journey we're about to take will be strange. It will challenge you. It might disturb you. But if you are willing to really listen, to really consider what this ancient provocateur has to say, you might discover that the path to freedom is simpler than you ever imagined, and far more radical than you ever dared to hope. There is a story about Diogenes that captures the essence of his philosophy better than any abstract explanation possibly could. It involves the most powerful man in the world at that time, coming face to face with a man who owned literally nothing. And the man who owned nothing won the encounter so decisively that the story has echoed through history as a perfect example of what real freedom looks like. Alexander the Great, the legendary conqueror who would eventually rule an empire stretching from Greece to India, heard about the strange philosopher living in a barrel. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps to demonstrate his own magnanimity, perhaps because even world conquerors occasionally wonder whether they have chosen the right path, Alexander decided to pay Diogenes a visit. Picture the scene. The young king approaches with his entourage, surrounded by guards, generals, advisors, and all the trappings of supreme power. He is dressed in royal finery. He radiates authority and command. Behind him lies the power to conquer cities, to raise armies, to reshape the world according to his will. He is, by any conventional measure, the freest and most powerful human being alive. And there, sitting in his jar, is Diogenes. Ragged, dirty, possessing nothing, commanding no one, respected by almost no one. By every conventional measure, he has nothing and is nothing. Alexander stands before the philosopher, casting a shadow over the smaller man. The crowd holds its breath. What will happen when supreme power meets supreme indifference to power? "I am Alexander the Great," the king says, his voice carrying the weight of countless victories. Diogenes looks up at him, unimpressed. "And I am Diogenes the dog." The crowd shifts uncomfortably. This filthy beggar has just compared himself to a dog in the presence of the king. But Alexander, to his credit, is intrigued. He has met countless people who groveled before him, who flattered him, who wanted something from him. This response is genuinely new. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Alexander asks, perhaps genuinely curious, perhaps testing this strange man. It is an extraordinary offer. The most powerful person in the world is offering a favor to a man who lives in a jar. Name anything, and it could be his. Wealth, position, land, power, anything. Diogenes examines the king for a long moment. Then he says, with complete seriousness and not a hint of deference, "Yes, you can move out of my son. That is all. Not gold, not position, not favor, not protection. Just move out of my sun. You are blocking my light, and I would like you to step aside. The crowd gasps. Some of Alexander's men reach for their weapons. This is an insult to their king. This dirty philosopher just dismissed the most powerful man in the world, as if he were a minor inconvenience, a cloud passing in front of the sun. But Alexander, according to the story, is not offended. Instead, he turns to his companions and says something remarkable. If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. Think about what this means. The king who has everything, who can have anything, who commands legions and conquers nations, looks at this man who has nothing and commands no one, and recognizes something he himself lacks. He recognizes freedom, because here is what Alexander understood in that moment, and what most people never understand. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. True freedom is not needing anything from anyone. Alexander could conquer the world, but he could not be satisfied. His ambition drove him forward constantly. He needed more, always more. More territory, more glory, more proof of his greatness. He was a slave to his own desires, to his own need for conquest and recognition. Diogenes needed nothing. He wanted nothing from Alexander. He could not be threatened, bribed, flattered, or manipulated. He was completely and utterly free, in a way that no amount of power or wealth or conquest could ever make someone free. And Alexander, one of the smartest people of his generation, recognized this immediately. This is the first and most fundamental teaching of Diogenes. Freedom comes from needing nothing, not from having everything. Not from being able to get everything, from needing nothing. Now, your immediate reaction is probably that this is impossible. We all need things. We need food, shelter, clothing, human connection. We need security, comfort, love, purpose. You cannot just need nothing. That is not how human beings work. But Diogenes would say, you are confusing needs with wants. You are confusing what is actually necessary for human survival and flourishing with what your culture has taught you to desire. The gap between these two things is enormous, and your entire life is probably organized around pursuing things that fall into the second category, while telling yourself they belong in the first. Let me give you an example. Do you need a smartphone? Right now, at this very moment, your brain probably said yes. Of course you need a smartphone. How would you function in modern society without one? How would you work, communicate, navigate, stay informed, stay connected? A smartphone is not a luxury, it is a necessity. But is it? Billions of people throughout human history lived full, meaningful lives without smartphones. Even in your own lifetime, there was a period, probably not that long ago, when you did not have a smartphone, and you survived. More than survived. Were you less happy then? Were you less free? Or have you simply become dependent on something that you then redefine as necessary to justify that dependence? Diogenes would look at your smartphone and see a chain, not because there is anything inherently wrong with technology, but because you have allowed yourself to need it. And anything you need owns you. The moment you need something, you become vulnerable. You become controllable. You become unfree. This applies to everything. Your house with its mortgage that requires you to work a job you hate for 30 years. Your car that requires insurance, maintenance, fuel, and parking. Your wardrobe that requires constant updating to keep up with fashion. Your social media presence that requires constant management. Your career that requires constant networking and professional development. Your relationships that require constant maintenance and emotional labor. None of these things are inherently bad. Diogenes is not saying you should never have anything or care about anything. He is saying that the moment you need something, you become its slave. And most of what you think you need, You actually do not need it all. You have simply convinced yourself you need it, because everyone around you has convinced themselves they need it, and you are all reinforcing each other's illusions. The story about Alexander perfectly captures this reversal of conventional wisdom. Who is really rich? The king with unlimited wealth, or the philosopher who needs nothing? Who is really powerful? The conqueror who commands armies, or the man who cannot be threatened or bribed? Who is really free? The person who can go anywhere and do anything, or the person who is content exactly where they are? Diogenes spent his entire life demonstrating that happiness and freedom do not come from adding things to your life. They come from subtracting things from your life until nothing remains but what is essential. And what is essential is far, far less than you think. But here is where Diogenes gets really challenging. Because he did not just theorize about this, he lived it. He did not write books about voluntary simplicity and then go home to a comfortable house. He actually gave up everything and lived in a jar. He actually went through life owning nothing but a cloak and a staff. He actually tested his philosophy against reality every single day, and reality confirmed he was right. There is another story that illustrates this even more dramatically. Diogenes, as minimal as his possessions were, still owned one thing he considered useful, a simple wooden bowl that he used for eating and drinking. This bowl represented the absolute minimum of material possessions. He had reduced his life down to nothing but necessities, and this bowl was one of them. Until one day, he saw a child drinking water by cupping his hands and bringing them to his mouth. Diogenes watched this simple act and suddenly realized something profound. If a child could drink without a bowl, then even this minimal possession was unnecessary. Even his bowl was excessive. Even his bowl was something he could do without. And so, right there, he threw the bowl away, his last possession gone. He had reached a level of simplicity that most people cannot even imagine, and he decided it was still too complicated. He could live even more simply. He could need even less. Try to imagine doing this in your own life. Try to imagine looking at your most essential possession, the thing you absolutely need to function, and deciding you could actually live without it. What would that even be? Your phone, your computer, your car, your bed? Can you imagine voluntarily giving up something you currently consider essential? Not because you are being noble or making a sacrifice, but because you genuinely realize you do not need it. This is what Diogenes did constantly. He was always looking for ways to simplify further, to need less, to be more free. And he discovered something remarkable. The less he needed, the happier he became. The fewer possessions he owned, the less he had to worry about. The fewer social obligations he maintained, the more time he had for philosophy. The less he cared what others thought, the more freely he could speak the truth. This is completely backwards from how we normally think about progress and improvement. We think getting better means adding things to our lives. Better job, nicer house, more friends, fuller calendar, richer experiences. We measure progress by accumulation. Diogenes measured progress by elimination. And here is what makes this more than just an interesting historical anecdote. Diogenes was not unusual in his time for being poor or homeless. Plenty of people in ancient Athens had nothing. What made Diogenes unique was that he chose it. He was actually from a wealthy family in Sinope. He had access to comfort and respectability. He gave it up deliberately, not because of misfortune, but because of philosophy. He tested poverty and simplicity against wealth and complexity, and poverty and simplicity won. This is not a man who is bitter about not having things. This is not a man rationalizing his circumstances. This is a man who had the choice and chose what almost no one chooses. And he spent the rest of his life trying to explain to people that they were choosing wrong, that they were enslaving themselves to things they did not need in pursuit of happiness that would never come. Now, You might be thinking this is all very interesting, but completely impractical for modern life. You cannot live in a barrel. You have responsibilities. You have a family, a job, obligations. Diogenes could do this because he was a single man in ancient Athens, with no responsibilities to anyone but himself. His example does not translate to contemporary circumstances, but this is exactly the kind of excuse Diogenes spent his life mocking. I cannot be free because of my circumstances is just another way of saying, I am not willing to be free because the price is too high. And maybe that is true. Maybe the price is too high for you. But then you should at least be honest about it. You should at least admit that you value comfort and security and social approval more than you value freedom. Diogenes would say that your circumstances are not trapping you. Your choices are trapping you. Your desires are trapping you. Your fears are trapping you. And all of these things are within your control, even if it does not feel that way right now. Consider what it would actually look like to need less. Not nothing, just less. What if you simplified your life by 20%? What if you got rid of 20% of your possessions, 20% of your commitments, 20% of your desires? What would happen? Would you be less happy, or would you be more free? What if you stopped buying things you do not need to impress people you do not like? What if you stopped saying yes to social obligations that drain your energy? What if you stopped pursuing career advancement that requires sacrificing everything else you care about? What if you questioned whether you actually want the things you are working so hard to get? These are not radical suggestions. These are modest steps toward the kind of freedom that Diogenes achieved completely. And yet for most people, even these modest steps feel impossible. Why? What are you afraid of losing? What are you afraid others will think? What version of yourself are you protecting? Diogenes threw away his bowl because he realized it was unnecessary. What bowls are you carrying around that you do not actually need? What possessions, relationships, ambitions, identities, stories about yourself are you clinging to out of habit or fear rather than genuine necessity? As you drift deeper into rest, consider the image of Alexander and Diogenes facing each other. The man with everything and the man with nothing, and consider which one was actually free. Consider which one was actually happy. Consider which one was actually living according to his own values rather than performing for an audience. And ask yourself which one you want to be, not which one you should want to be. Not which one looks better or sounds more respectable. Which one do you actually, honestly want to be? Because that answer will tell you everything you need to know about what comes next. There is something we must confront directly now, something that makes most people profoundly uncomfortable. Diogenes was not just advocating for simplicity or minimalism. He was not just suggesting we could be happier with less. He was claiming something far more provocative and far more disturbing. He was claiming that civilization itself is a trap, that respectability is a cage, and that everything you have been taught about how to live a good life is designed to make you useful to others rather than free for yourself. This is not a popular message. It never has been. People do not like being told that the entire structure of their society is designed to exploit them. They especially do not like being told this by someone who looks like a homeless vagrant and smells like he has not bathed in months. But being unpopular does not make an idea false. And Diogenes spent his entire life demonstrating that the respectable life, the one everyone pursues and celebrates, is actually a sophisticated form of slavery. Let me be specific about what this means. You wake up in the morning at a time determined by someone else, because you have a job that requires you to be somewhere at a specific time. You put on clothes that meet certain standards of professionalism and respectability, even if they are uncomfortable or not, how you would naturally dress. You commute to a location you would not choose to go to, spending time you will never get back, to do work that is quite possibly meaningless or actively harmful to the world, for people you probably do not like, in service of goals you do not share, to earn money to pay for things you think you need, but probably do not. And you do this every day, for decades, until you are finally allowed to retire, by which point you are often too exhausted or unhealthy to actually enjoy the freedom you theoretically earned. This is considered normal. This is considered responsible. This is what successful people do. Diogenes would call this slavery, not metaphorical slavery, not metaphorical slavery, actual slavery. You have given your life, your time, your energy, your freedom to others in exchange for money and social approval. You have accepted a bargain where you sacrifice the present for a promised future that may never come. You have allowed yourself to be domesticated like a farm animal, producing value for others while receiving just enough reward to keep you producing. But wait, you are thinking, this is too extreme. Having a job is not slavery. Participating in society is not slavery. People need to work. Society needs to function. We cannot all just live in barrels and reject every social norm. And Diogenes would respond by asking you a simple question. Why not? Not in a naive way, but seriously. Why is it impossible? Why must you accept this bargain? And who benefits from you believing it is impossible to live any other way? Because here is what most people never examine. You did not choose the rules of the game you are playing. You were born into a system that was already running, taught that certain things were necessary and valuable and respectable, and then pressured through countless mechanisms to conform to these standards. And you did conform, as almost everyone does, because the costs of not conforming seemed too high. But what are those costs really? Social disapproval? Being thought of as strange or irresponsible? Having less money and fewer possessions? These are the prices of freedom. And they seem unbearably high only because you have been taught to value social approval and material comfort above everything else. You've been domesticated so thoroughly that you cannot even imagine being wild. Diogenes was sold into slavery, literally. Pirates captured him and put him up for sale in a slave market. And when potential buyers asked what he could do, he pointed to a wealthy man in the crowd and said, "Sell me to him. He needs a master." The audacity of this response is breathtaking. A man being sold as property claims that his buyer needs a master more than he does. And he was right. He ended up becoming tutor to his owner's sons, and the historical record suggests he was highly valued in this role. Because even as a literal slave, Diogenes was freer than the free people around him. His owner had to worry about managing wealth, maintaining status, dealing with business obligations, satisfying social expectations. Diogenes had to worry about none of these things. He could focus on philosophy and living according to his values. So who was really the slave? This is not just a clever rhetorical point. This is a genuine insight into what slavery actually means. Slavery is not primarily about legal status. Slavery is about who controls your life, who determines how you spend your time, who decides what you do and when and for what purpose. By this definition, most people today are slaves even though they are legally free. They spend the vast majority of their waking hours doing things they would not choose to do, in places they would not choose to be, for purposes they do not truly care about, because they need money to survive and social approval to avoid being ostracized. And the genius of modern slavery is that it does not need chains or whips. It does not need to force you into compliance. It just needs to make you believe you are choosing freely when you are actually responding to carefully constructed incentives and punishments. It needs to make you believe that your cage is actually the world, and that anything outside the cage is impossible or undesirable. Consider your job. Most people spend at least 40 hours per week working, often more when you include commute time and time spent thinking about work outside of work hours. That is more time than you spend with your family, more time than you spend on hobbies or personal interests, more time than you spend doing anything else, except perhaps sleeping. Your job is where your life goes. Now ask yourself honestly, if you had enough money to live comfortably without working, would you still do your current job? Most people answer no immediately. They would do something else, something meaningful to them, something that reflects their actual values and interests. Or they would do nothing, which is itself revealing. The fact that you would stop doing something if you did not need the money proves that you are not doing it for its own sake. You are not doing it because it brings you joy or fulfillment or purpose. You are doing it because you are being compensated to do it. This is wage slavery. You are renting yourself to someone else by the hour. You are accepting payment in exchange for control over your time and activity. And the going rate is apparently enough to make this bargain seem acceptable. But Diogenes would ask you to calculate the real cost. Not just in hours, but in freedom, in authenticity, in the opportunity to live according to your own values and judgment. How much is your freedom worth? Can it be bought? If so, what is the price? $40,000 per year? 80,000? 200,000? At what price would you sell your freedom completely? And having calculated that price, consider that you may have already sold it for far less than you think. But the job is just one example. Consider every other aspect of respectable life. Your home, which requires a mortgage, which requires stable income, which requires keeping the job you might hate. Your car, which requires payments, insurance, maintenance, and fuel, all of which require money and thus work. Your wardrobe, which needs to be appropriate for your profession and social circle. Your furniture, appliances, technology, subscriptions, memberships. Each of these things seems individually reasonable. But taken together, they create a web of dependencies that makes it almost impossible to step off the treadmill. You cannot quit your job because you have mortgage payments. You cannot sell your house because property values are down or you are underwater on your loan. You cannot get rid of your car because public transportation is inadequate. You cannot simplify your life because your entire social identity is wrapped up in displaying the markers of success. Every chain links to another chain until you cannot see where your choices end and your obligations begin. And this is before we even discuss the psychological chains. The need to be seen as successful by your family. The fear of disappointing people who have expectations for you. The terror of being judged as irresponsible or lazy or a failure. The deep-seated belief that your worth as a person is determined by your productivity and achievements. These psychological chains are often far stronger than the material ones. You could probably survive on much less money than you think, but could you survive the judgment of others? Could you survive your own internal critic telling you that you are not good enough? Diogenes lived as if none of these chains existed, and the shocking thing is that he was fine. More than fine. He was happy. He was free. He spent his time on things that actually mattered to him, which was primarily philosophy and living according to his values. He had no boss, no mortgage, no social obligations, no need to impress anyone, no fear of judgment, no career to protect. He was utterly and completely free in a way that almost no one else was then or is now. And this freedom threatened people. It threatened them deeply. Because if Diogenes could be happy with nothing, then what did that say about their own lives? If he could be free by simply choosing freedom, then what excuse did they have for their own enslavement? His existence was a walking refutation of everything they believed about what was necessary for a good life, so they mocked him. They called him a dog, a madman, a public nuisance. They told stories about his outrageous behavior to demonstrate that he was not someone to take seriously. They created social pressure that would force most people back into conformity. But Diogenes did not care. He could not be shamed back into the cage because he did not accept their values or their judgments. He had stepped outside the entire system and could see it clearly for what it was. There is a concept in Diogenes' philosophy called defacing the currency. He took this phrase literally at one point in his life, allegedly defacing actual coins, which got him exiled from his home city. But the deeper meaning is philosophical. The currency he wanted to deface was not money, but values, conventional standards, social norms. He wanted to show that what society values as precious is often worthless, and what society dismisses as worthless is often precious. Reputation? Worthless. It is just other people's opinions, and other people are usually wrong about what matters. Wealth? Worthless. It does not bring happiness, and it creates endless complications and dependencies. Social status? Worthless. It requires constant maintenance and performance, and it can be lost in an instant. Physical comfort? Overvalued. You can adapt to far less than you think, and the adaptation itself is liberating. Meanwhile, freedom is precious. Self-knowledge is precious. Living according to your own values is precious. Being able to speak truth without fear of consequences is precious. Having time to think and reflect and philosophize is precious. These are the things that actually matter, and these are precisely the things that respectable life makes almost impossible to attain. Diogenes defaced the currency by living in a way that demonstrated this reversal of values. Every time he appeared in public, he was making a philosophical argument with his entire body. "Look at me," he was saying. "I have nothing, and I am free. You have everything, and you are slaves. You've been tricked into believing that your way of life is good and mine is terrible. But I am happy and you are miserable. I am free and you are trapped. I can say and do whatever I want, and you must constantly watch yourselves." Who is really winning here? The answer was obvious to anyone willing to look honestly. But most people were not willing to look honestly because the implications were too threatening. If Diogenes was right, then they had wasted years or decades of their lives pursuing things that did not matter and sacrificing things that did matter. This is almost impossible to admit to yourself, let alone to others. It is easier to dismiss Diogenes as crazy and go back to your comfortable illusions. But sometimes, late at night, when you cannot sleep because of anxiety about work or money, or what people think of you, perhaps you wonder. Perhaps you feel the chains even if you cannot name them. Perhaps you sense that something is wrong with your life, even though it looks right by every conventional measure. Perhaps you are exhausted from maintaining a performance that never ends and serving goals you do not truly believe in. Diogenes would say that this exhaustion, this anxiety, this vague sense of wrongness, is your authentic self trying to break through the conditioning. It is the part of you that knows you are living someone else's life according to someone else's values. It is the part of you that is still wild, still free, still capable of choosing differently even though you have forgotten how. The question is whether you will listen to that voice or drown it out with more work, more purchases, more distractions, more performances. Because acknowledging that voice means acknowledging that your current path might be wrong, and that is terrifying. It is easier to be a comfortable slave than an uncomfortable free person. It is easier to follow the script than to write your own story. It is easier to stay in the cage than to risk the wilderness. But Diogenes would remind you that the wilderness is where humans actually belong. We are not domesticated by nature. We are wild animals who have been trained to live in cages and convinced that the cages are protecting us rather than imprisoning us. And the proof is that you are not happy. The proof is that you are exhausted anxious and haunted by the feeling that life should be different somehow, even though you cannot quite articulate what that difference would look like. That difference is freedom. That difference is authenticity. That difference is living according to your own nature and values rather than performing for an audience that does not even care about you beyond your usefulness to them. And the terrifying, liberating truth is that this is available to you right now, not someday when circumstances are different, not after you achieve certain goals or reach certain milestones. Right now, you could choose differently. You could start simplifying. You could start questioning. You could start saying no to obligations that do not serve you, and yes to possibilities you have been too afraid to pursue. You could begin the process of defacing the currency in your own life, revealing what actually has value and what is just social performance. Will you? Probably not. Most people will not. The costs seem too high and the benefits too uncertain. But now at least you know that it is a choice. Now at least you cannot pretend that you have no options, that circumstances have trapped you, that this is just how life has to be. You know there is another way, because Diogenes lived it. And if one person can do it, then it is possible. And if it is possible, then your continued participation in the system is a choice, not an inevitability. And choices have consequences. The consequence of choosing safety and respectability is a life spent in service to others rather than yourself. That might be worth it, but it might not be. Only you can decide, but you should decide consciously with full awareness of what you are choosing and what you are giving up. Because unconscious choices made out of fear and conditioning are not really choices at all. They are just another form of slavery. Let us turn now to what might be the most uncomfortable aspect of Diogenes' philosophy: his absolute commitment to honesty, regardless of consequences. Not just personal honesty with himself, though that was central to his practice, but public honesty that violated every social convention about polite discourse and appropriate behavior. Diogenes said exactly what he thought, always, to everyone, no matter who they were or how powerful they were, or what the costs might be. This is not a virtue that modern society celebrates in practice, even though we claim to value it in theory. We say we want truth and transparency, but what we actually want is a carefully managed version of truth that does not make us too uncomfortable or threaten our self-image. We want honesty up to the point where it starts to hurt. Then we want tact, diplomacy, sensitivity. We want the truth softened and shaped and presented in ways that preserve our feelings and relationships and social standing. Diogenes had no patience for this kind of cowardice. He saw it as one more way that people lie to themselves and each other, one more way that society domesticates individuals and prevents them from seeing reality clearly. If you cannot handle hearing the truth, that is your problem, not the truth-teller's problem. If you need comfortable lies to maintain your self-esteem, then your self-esteem is built on sand and deserves to collapse. This is why he walked through Athens in broad daylight, carrying a lit lamp, claiming to be looking for an honest person. It was performance philosophy, street theater designed to make a point. But what exactly was the point? Simply this: everyone lies. Everyone performs. Everyone presents a version of themselves to the world that is calculated to produce certain responses and maintain certain relationships. No one is completely honest about who they are, what they want, what they fear, what they truly believe. This performance starts early. Children learn very quickly to hide certain thoughts and feelings and display others based on what gets rewarded and what gets punished. As adults, we become so skilled at this performance that we forget we are doing it. We mistake our public persona for our authentic self. We lose track of where the performance ends and the real person begins, if there is even a distinction anymore. Diogenes saw through all of this. He could see the performance because he was not performing himself. And what he saw was a city full of actors, all pretending to be something they were not, all lying to each other and to themselves, all trapped in an elaborate dance of deception that everyone had agreed to call normal social interaction. So he walked around with his lamp, searching, always searching, for someone who had dropped the mask, someone who would say what they actually thought instead of what they were supposed to think, someone who would admit what they actually wanted instead of what respectable people were supposed to want. Someone who would acknowledge their actual motivations instead of presenting noble-sounding rationalizations. He never found this person because this person does not exist in civilized society. Civilization requires dishonesty. It requires performance. It requires that you pretend certain things are true even when you know they are false. Consider how much of your daily interaction consists of lies or at best half-truths. Not malicious lies necessarily, but social lies designed to smooth over awkwardness and maintain relationships. Someone asks how you are doing and you say, fine, even when you are not fine. Someone shows you their new purchase or achievement and you offer congratulations even when you think it was a waste of money or a meaningless accomplishment. Someone shares an opinion you disagree with and you nod politely instead of challenging them. Someone invites you to something you do not want to attend and you make up an excuse instead of just saying no. These seem like small things. These seem like necessary lubricants for social interaction. But they add up to a life of constant, low-level dishonesty. And this dishonesty corrupts you from the inside. Every time you say something you do not mean, every time you present yourself as something you are not, every time you go along with something you do not agree with, you lose a small piece of your authenticity. Eventually, you become so practiced at lying that you do it automatically, without even noticing. You become a performance looking for an audience, having forgotten what you were before the performance began. Diogenes refused all of this. When he thought someone was being foolish, he told them they were being foolish. When he saw behavior he found contemptible, he said so directly. When asked questions, he gave honest answers instead of socially appropriate answers. This made him extremely unpopular. It also made him completely free. Because once you give up the need for others to like you, once you give up the need for social approval, once you accept that people will probably hate you for telling the truth, then you are beyond their control. This is a terrifying freedom that most people never experience. We spend our entire lives modulating our behavior and speech to maintain relationships and avoid conflict. We censor ourselves constantly. We second-guess everything we say. We worry about how we will be perceived. This creates a psychological prison that is in some ways more restrictive than physical imprisonment. At least in a physical prison, you know you are not free. In this psychological prison, you tell yourself you are free, while voluntarily restricting your own thoughts and expression at every moment. Diogenes demonstrated this dramatically in his encounters with powerful people. When Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it into Plato's academy, announcing, "Here is Plato's human being." When he saw distinguished citizens being overly concerned with philosophical abstractions while ignoring practical problems, he would walk around in broad daylight, bumping into people and asking where all the humans had gone, implying that these supposedly civilized people had lost touch with basic humanity. But his most famous demonstration of absolute honesty was his encounter with Alexander the Great, which we already discussed. Think about what courage that took. The most powerful person in the world offers you anything you want, and you tell him to get out of your sun. You do not flatter him, you do not thank him, you do not treat him with the deference everyone else shows him. You treat him like an ordinary person whose shadow is inconvenient. This was not rudeness for its own sake. This was radical honesty. Diogenes did not think Alexander deserved special treatment just because he was king. He did not think power and status entitled someone to deference and flattery. He treated everyone the same, which meant he treated everyone honestly, based on his actual assessment of them rather than their social position. Most people cannot imagine speaking this way to power. Most people cannot imagine risking the displeasure of someone who could harm them. But this fear is precisely what gives power its hold over you. If you are willing to speak truth regardless of consequences, then power has no leverage. It can punish you, but it cannot control you. It can harm your body, but it cannot reach your mind. This is what made Diogenes' honesty so threatening. It was not just that he said uncomfortable things, it was that he demonstrated that you could say uncomfortable things and survive. He showed that the social consequences everyone fears so much are actually not that bad. Yes, people will be angry. Yes, you will be excluded from certain circles. Yes, opportunities will close to you. But none of that is unbearable. None of that is worse than the alternative, which is spending your life being dishonest to avoid disapproval from people whose approval should not matter anyway. Now, I can hear the objections forming in your mind. You are thinking that this is all very well for an ancient philosopher with no responsibilities, but you have people depending on you. You have a family to support, a career to maintain, relationships to preserve. You cannot just say whatever you think without regard for consequences. That is childish and irresponsible. And Diogenes would say that these responsibilities are often just excuses for cowardice. Yes, you have obligations, but are your obligations really served by lying? Is your family better off because you are dishonest? Is your career enhanced by pretending to believe things you do not believe? Are your relationships deeper because you hide your true thoughts and feelings? Or are these obligations being used as excuses to avoid the discomfort of authenticity? Because being honest is uncomfortable. It creates conflict. It makes people angry. It forces you to defend positions instead of hiding behind pleasantries. It is easier to lie, to perform, to go along with social scripts that make everyone comfortable, even though nobody is actually satisfied. But this ease comes at enormous cost. When you lie constantly, you lose yourself. You become a collection of responses to social stimuli, rather than a coherent individual with genuine beliefs and values. You drift through life playing roles, without any center, any core, any authentic self that exists independent of the performances. Diogenes saw this everywhere he looked. People who could tell you what they were supposed to think about every topic, but had no idea what they actually thought. People who could describe their professional identity, their family role, their social position, but could not tell you who they were beneath all those labels. People who had become so identified with their performances that they had forgotten they were performing. And he saw that this dishonesty was not just individual, but structural. Society requires lying to function. Institutions depend on people accepting official narratives that do not match reality. Power structures survive only as long as people pretend to believe in their legitimacy. Social hierarchies persist because everyone agrees to treat arbitrary distinctions as if they were natural and necessary. This is why Diogenes' honesty was not just personally liberating, but politically radical. Every time he told an uncomfortable truth, he was pulling back the curtain on the agreed-upon fiction that makes civilization possible. Every time he refused to show deference to someone based on their status, he was exposing the arbitrary nature of social hierarchy. Every time he said what everyone was thinking but no one would say, he was demonstrating that the emperor had no clothes, that power was less absolute than it appeared, that the entire social structure was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. This is why authorities throughout history have always been more frightened of truth-tellers than of armed rebels. Armed rebels can be fought and defeated. Truth-tellers are much more dangerous because they cannot be defeated by force. You can imprison them, exile them, even kill them, but you cannot make their truths less true. And once uncomfortable truths are spoken aloud, once people hear them and recognize them, the spell is broken. The official narrative loses its power. The performance is revealed as performance. Diogenes understood all of this. He understood that honesty was not just a personal virtue but a revolutionary act. By refusing to lie, he was refusing to participate in the system of social control that depends on everyone accepting convenient fictions. By saying what he actually thought, he was creating space for others to do the same. By treating everyone the same regardless of their status, he was revealing that status itself was a fiction maintained through collective pretense. But here is the difficult question you must ask yourself. Are you willing to pay the price of honesty? Because there is a price. People will not like you as much when you stop telling them what they want to hear. You will lose relationships that were based on mutual pretense. You will find yourself excluded from social circles that require certain performances for admission. You will discover that many people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths and will resent you for forcing them to confront reality. This is why most people choose comforting dishonesty over uncomfortable truth, not because they do not know they are lying, but because the costs of honesty seem too high. Better to keep the mask on, to maintain the performance, to tell the lies that everyone expects and avoid the conflict that truth creates. But Diogenes would say that this calculation is wrong. The real cost is not the price of honesty, but the price of dishonesty. Every lie you tell, every performance you maintain, every time you hide your authentic thoughts and feelings, you lose a piece of yourself. You become more alienated from your own experience, more disconnected from your own values, more trapped in roles and identities that were never really yours to begin with. And eventually you wake up one day and realize you do not know who you are anymore. You have played so many roles, told so many lies, performed for so many audiences that there is nothing left behind the performances. You have become a hollow person, technically alive but not really living, going through the motions of existence without any authentic engagement with reality. This is the real price of dishonesty. This is what you are actually sacrificing when you choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Not just your integrity, though that is part of it, your actual self, your capacity for genuine thought and feeling and connection. Your ability to live as a coherent individual rather than a collection of social performances. As sleep begins to pull you under, consider this question. When was the last time you said exactly what you thought, without filtering it through considerations of how it would be received? When was the last time you behaved exactly as you wanted to behave, without adjusting yourself to meet social expectations? When was the last time you were completely honest with someone, even knowing it might damage your relationship? If you cannot remember, then you are already more performance than person. You are already more lie than truth. You are already living Diogenes' nightmare of a civilization full of actors, all searching for someone authentic, all finding only other actors who are searching for the same thing. The lamp is still lit. The search continues. The question is whether you are brave enough to stop performing long enough to let yourself be found, or whether you will remain hidden behind your masks, safe and comfortable and utterly lost. Now, we must discuss what is perhaps the most shocking and misunderstood aspect of Diogenes' philosophy: his absolute rejection of shame and his deliberate violation of every social taboo designed to enforce conformity. This is where most people decide that Diogenes went too far, that his philosophical points could have been made without such outrageous behavior, that he was being provocative merely for attention. They are wrong. The shamelessness was not incidental to his philosophy, it was central to it. Because shame is one of the primary mechanisms through which society controls individuals. Shame is the emotional enforcement of social norms. It is the feeling that makes you adjust your behavior to meet expectations even when no external punishment threatens. It is the internal police officer that makes you obey rules you do not agree with because the thought of being judged or rejected is unbearable. Diogenes understood that if you want to be truly free, you must become shameless, not in the sense of being cruel or harming others without remorse, but shameless in the sense of being immune to social disapproval, unmoved by judgment, unconcerned with maintaining respectability. This is incredibly difficult because shame is installed in us from early childhood. It is one of the primary tools parents and teachers use to socialize children. Be ashamed of certain behaviors and you will stop doing them even when no one is watching. So Diogenes deliberately did things that would make most people deeply ashamed. He ate in the marketplace, which was considered uncivilized. He masturbated in public, saying he wished he could satisfy his hunger as easily by rubbing his belly. He urinated and defecated in public like a dog. He slept wherever he was when tiredness overcame him. He did not hide his body or his bodily functions. He treated his physical needs as natural and nothing to be ashamed of. Now, before you dismiss this as mere exhibitionism or mental illness, consider what he was demonstrating. Human beings have bodies. These bodies have needs and functions. We eat, we defecate, we have sexual urges, we sleep, we get sick, we age, we die. These are fundamental facts of human existence. They are natural, universal, and nothing to be ashamed of. And yet we build enormous structures of shame and taboo around these basic biological realities. We hide our bodies. We hide our bodily functions. We create elaborate euphemisms to avoid talking about natural processes. We teach children that certain parts of their bodies and certain functions are shameful and must be concealed. We create hierarchies where some activities are appropriate in some contexts, but scandalous in others, based on arbitrary social conventions rather than any natural distinction. Why? What purpose does all this shame serve? Is it really about maintaining civilization, or is it about control? Is it really about respecting others, or is it about enforcing conformity? Diogenes suspected the latter. He suspected that most social rules about propriety and respectability were not designed to make life better, but to make people more controllable. Think about how much effort you put into managing other people's perceptions of you. You carefully control what you say and do in public. You hide aspects of yourself that might be judged negatively. You present a curated version of your life that emphasizes successes and conceals failures. You worry constantly about what others think, how you are being perceived, whether you are measuring up to standards you did not create and may not even agree with. All of this mental and emotional labor is exhausting. It consumes enormous amounts of energy that could be directed toward more meaningful pursuits. And it keeps you trapped in performance, always acting, never being, always concerned with the audience, never free to simply exist. Diogenes eliminated all of this with his shamelessness. By doing things that would make most people mortified, by violating taboos deliberately and publicly, by refusing to adjust his behavior to meet social expectations, he freed himself from the tyranny of other people's opinions. He literally could not be shamed because he felt no shame. And this made him invulnerable in a way that wealth or power or status never could. There is another dimension to this that is worth exploring. The things we are taught to be ashamed of are often the things that make us most fundamentally human. Our bodies, our desires, our needs, our vulnerabilities, our mortality. We are taught to hide these things, to transcend them, to pretend we are pure minds or souls, temporarily trapped in meat, rather than embodied creatures whose physicality is central to our existence. This creates a profound alienation from our own nature. We spend our lives fighting against what we actually are. trying to live up to ideals that require denying basic aspects of our humanity. We are ashamed of being hungry, of being tired, of being sexual, of aging, of being anything less than perfectly controlled rational beings. And this shame makes us miserable because it puts us in conflict with reality. Diogenes rejected this alienation completely. He embraced his animal nature. He called himself a dog and meant it positively. Dogs are not ashamed of their bodies or their needs. They do not hide their functions or pretend to be something they are not. They eat when hungry, sleep when tired, mate when aroused, and defecate when necessary. They live according to their nature, without apology or performance. Human beings, Diogenes believed, should do the same. Not in the sense that we should have no more than animal intelligence or capacity, but in the sense that we should stop being ashamed of our embodied existence and stop letting social conventions alienate us from our own nature. We should live as the animals we are, albeit animals with reason and the capacity for philosophy. This is why his shameless behavior was not random or attention-seeking. Every violation of taboo was a carefully aimed philosophical argument. When he ate in the marketplace, he was saying that there is nothing shameful about satisfying hunger. When he masturbated in public, he was saying that sexual desire is natural and should not be hidden. When he defecated like a dog, he was saying that bodily functions are part of being alive and nothing to be concealed. Each act was a demonstration that the emperor had no clothes, that social conventions were arbitrary, and that the shame they generated was serving control rather than well-being. Now, does this mean you should start defecating in public? Probably not, and Diogenes himself might not advise it in your context. The point is not to copy his specific behaviors, but to understand the principle behind them. The point is to ask yourself what you are ashamed of and why. The point is to examine whether the shame you feel is serving you or controlling you. Because here is what is fascinating. If you examine your deepest sources of shame, you will probably find that they are not about actual moral failings or harm to others. You are not ashamed of things that are genuinely bad. You are ashamed of things that society has taught you to be ashamed of. You're ashamed of not meeting arbitrary standards. You're ashamed of being judged. You're ashamed of being ordinary, of being human, of being exactly what you are. Your body is not as perfect as the idealized images you see in media. Shameful. Your career is not as impressive as those of people you compare yourself to. Shameful. Your thoughts and desires are not always noble or elevated. Shameful. Your life does not match the narrative of success that you absorbed growing up. Shameful. But none of these things are actually shameful unless you accept the standards that make them so. And accepting those standards means accepting external control over your internal experience. It means allowing other people to determine your sense of self-worth. It means living according to values you did not choose, and probably do not even agree with when you examine them carefully. Diogenes' shamelessness was liberation from this tyranny. By refusing to feel shame, he refused to be controlled. By doing things that would mortify most people, he demonstrated that the consequences were actually not that terrible. People were offended. So what? Being offensive is not actually harmful. People judged him negatively. So what? Their judgment could not hurt him. People excluded him from polite society. So what? Polite society was a cage he was happy to be free from. This is difficult for modern people to understand, because we have been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that social disapproval is one of the worst things that can happen to us. We would rather be physically uncomfortable than socially ostracized. We would rather suffer material hardship than be judged as failures. We would rather live lives we hate than be thought of negatively by people we do not even like. Diogenes proved this conditioning was a choice a choice you could reject. A choice he did reject, and in doing so became more free than people who had every material advantage. There is a deeper level to this as well. Shame is not just about social control, it is also about self-control, about keeping parts of yourself suppressed that might otherwise emerge. When you feel ashamed of a thought or desire or aspect of your personality, you push it down, hide it, pretend it does not exist. This creates an internal division where you are at war with yourself, where part of you is constantly policing other parts. This internal conflict is exhausting and ultimately futile. The parts of yourself you are ashamed of do not go away just because you hide them. They emerge in distorted forms. They influence you in unconscious ways. They create the psychological problems that drive people to therapy. The attempt to suppress and deny aspects of yourself that are actually natural and normal creates more suffering than simply accepting yourself as you are. Diogenes accepted himself completely. He had no internal censor, no hidden shame, no parts of himself he needed to hide. What you saw was what you got. And this integration, this wholeness, this lack of internal conflict was a large part of what made him seem so strange and what made him so free. Most people are fragmented. They have a public self and a private self, and possibly several other selves for different contexts. They show different faces to different audiences. They hide parts of themselves they think others would judge. They maintain multiple performances simultaneously. And this fragmentation requires constant effort and creates constant anxiety. What if the different selves are revealed? What if someone sees the parts you are trying to hide? Diogenes had none of this. He was the same person all the time, in all contexts, with all people. He had nothing to hide because he was not ashamed of anything. He did not adjust his behavior based on who was watching. He was integrated, whole, undivided. And this psychological integration was worth more than any amount of respectability or social approval. As you lie here listening to this, you might want to do an uncomfortable exercise. Think about what you are most ashamed of. Not necessarily the things you have done wrong by your own values, but the things you are ashamed of because you fear judgment. The aspects of your body, your past, your thoughts, your desires, your circumstances that you try to hide from others and sometimes from yourself. Now ask yourself, are these things actually bad, or are you ashamed of them only because you have been taught to be ashamed? Would you judge someone else harshly for these same things? Or is the harshness reserved for yourself? If your shame is not about genuine harm, but about failure to meet arbitrary standards, then that shame is not serving you. It is controlling you. It is making you smaller than you are. It is keeping you trapped in performances and hiding when you could be free and authentic. Diogenes would say that letting go of this shame is one of the most important steps toward freedom. Not by doing shameful things, but by recognizing that the things you are ashamed of are probably not actually shameful. By accepting yourself, including the parts that do not match the idealized images you were taught to aspire to. By refusing to feel bad about being human. This is harder than it sounds. Shame is deeply installed. It operates automatically. You can intellectually recognize that your shame is irrational and yet still feel it powerfully. But awareness is the first step. Once you see how shame is operating in you, once you see how it is serving control rather than well-being, you can begin to question it. You can begin to challenge it. You can begin to live as though you have nothing to be ashamed of, because you do not. You are a human being. You have a body. You have needs and desires and functions. You have thoughts that are not always elevated. You have a past that is not always admirable. You have circumstances that are not always impressive, and none of this is shameful unless you accept the judgment that makes it so. Diogenes accepted no such judgment, and in refusing to be shamed, he became unshakable. Let that image drift with you into sleep. A man who cannot be moved by insult or diminished by disgrace because he has transcended shame entirely. A man who is exactly what he is, without apology or concealment. A man who is, in this profound sense, finally and completely free. We have arrived at something crucial that separates Diogenes from almost every philosopher who came before or after him. For Diogenes, philosophy was not an intellectual exercise. It was not a career or a discipline or something you studied. Philosophy was life itself. The way you lived was your philosophy. The choices you made, the things you owned or did not own, the way you treated your body, the manner in which you spoke to others. All of this was philosophical practice. This seems obvious when stated plainly, but it represents a fundamental challenge to how most people understand philosophy. We think of philosophy as something that happens in books and classrooms and academic discussions. We think philosophers are people who generate theories and arguments about abstract questions. We think you can be a great philosopher while living in a way that contradicts your philosophical positions. Diogenes would call this absurd. He would say that a philosophy you do not live is not really a philosophy at all. It is just words, just entertainment for the mind, just intellectual masturbation that has no connection to reality and no effect on how actual human life is conducted. Consider the philosophers of his time. Plato, brilliant and influential, developed complex theories about ideal forms, the nature of reality, and the best way to organize society. He founded an academy, taught students, wrote dialogues that are still studied today. By conventional measures, he was one of the most important philosophers who ever lived, and Diogenes mocked him relentlessly. When Plato defined humans as featherless bipeds, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy, demonstrating the inadequacy of clever definitions disconnected from lived reality. When Plato philosophized about ideal forms existing in a transcendent realm, Diogenes responded that he could see a cup and a table, but he could not see cupness or tableness, suggesting that these abstractions were mental constructions rather than profound insights into reality. This was not just Diogenes being difficult or anti-intellectual. He was making a serious philosophical point. Philosophy that remains in the realm of abstraction, that does not connect to how we actually live, that does not change behavior or inform practice, is useless. What is the point of knowing the good if you do not do the good? What is the point of understanding virtue if you do not practice virtue? What is the point of developing theories about human flourishing if your own life is not flourishing? This is where Diogenes becomes extremely uncomfortable for academic philosophers and intellectuals generally. Because most intellectuals live in a significant gap between what they profess to believe and how they actually live. They will write brilliant essays about justice while treating service workers rudely. They will lecture about simple living while accumulating possessions and status. They will theorize about equality while carefully maintaining hierarchical social relationships that benefit them. They will speak eloquently about wisdom while making foolish personal decisions. Diogenes had no such gap. His life was his argument. When he said that happiness does not depend on possessions, he proved it by owning nothing and being happy. When he said that status and reputation do not matter, he proved it by becoming the most infamous man in Athens and remaining unbothered. When he said that you should follow nature rather than convention, he proved it by living exactly as his nature directed without regard for social rules. His philosophy was not a theory about how to live. It was a demonstration of a life fully lived according to principle. This is what made him dangerous. Theories can be debated, arguments can be refuted, abstract positions can be dismissed as impractical or extreme. But a living example is much harder to dismiss. When someone is actually doing the thing you say is impossible, when they are actually living according to principles you claim are unworkable, when they are actually happy in circumstances you insist would make happiness impossible, then you have to either admit they are right or create elaborate explanations for why their example does not count. The Athenian establishment did both. They admitted that Diogenes was remarkable and unusual, but they insisted he was not someone to emulate. They called him a dog, a madman, a shameless vagrant. They treated him as an exception that proved the rule rather than a challenge to the rule itself. They maintained their comfortable lives and their conventional wisdom by categorizing Diogenes as someone who did not count, whose example was irrelevant because he was so far outside normal parameters. But this dismissal was defensive. It had to be defensive because Diogenes threatened the entire basis of their lives. If he was right, then they were wrong. If his way of living was better than theirs, then they had wasted years or decades pursuing things that did not matter and sacrificing things that did matter. This is almost impossible to admit, especially when you have built an entire identity and social position around your choices. So they protected themselves by making Diogenes into a clown, a curiosity, someone to be laughed at but not taken seriously. And yet, they could not entirely dismiss him. Even his critics admitted that there was something impressive about his absolute commitment to his principles. Even those who rejected his philosophy recognized that he was genuinely free in a way they were not. Alexander's response to Diogenes was telling. The most powerful man in the world acknowledged that if he could not be Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes. Not Plato, not Aristotle, not any of the respectable philosophers with their schools and students and influence. He would want to be the beggar in the barrel, because that beggar had something that power and conquest could never provide. This brings us to a challenging question. What is your philosophy? Not what you say you believe, but what your life demonstrates you believe. Because your real philosophy is revealed not by your words, but by your choices. What you actually value is shown by what you actually do, not by what you claim to value. If you say you value family, but spend all your time at work, then your real philosophy is that career success matters more than relationships. If you say you value health, but treat your body poorly, then your real philosophy is that immediate pleasure or convenience matters more than long-term well-being. If you say you value authenticity but constantly perform for others, then your real philosophy is that social approval matters more than being yourself. If you say you value freedom, but make choices that create more obligations and dependencies, then your real philosophy is that security matters more than liberty. This is not meant as judgment, but as observation. Most people have never consciously chosen their philosophy. They inherited it from their culture, absorbed it from their upbringing, adopted it to fit in with their peer group. They follow a philosophy they did not create, do not fully understand, and quite possibly do not even agree with if they examined it carefully. But they follow it nonetheless because that is what people around them do and because choosing differently seems too difficult or too risky. Diogenes consciously chose his philosophy and then lived it completely. He did not inherit his values from his culture because he rejected most cultural values. He did not adopt his lifestyle to fit in because fitting in was precisely what he was trying to avoid. He examined the question of how to live, arrived at conclusions based on reason and observation, and then structured his entire existence around those conclusions. This is what philosophy as a way of life means. Not studying philosophy, not learning about philosophical traditions, or memorizing arguments, or discussing abstract questions. Living according to a consciously chosen set of principles that you have tested against reality and found to be true. For Diogenes, those principles were relatively simple. Human beings flourish by following nature rather than convention. Happiness comes from needing nothing rather than having everything. Freedom requires independence from social approval and material circumstances. Virtue is about how you live, not what you think or say. Wisdom is recognizing what actually matters rather than what you have been taught to value. These principles led directly to his lifestyle. Living simply followed from needing nothing. Living shamelessly followed from independence, from social approval. Living honestly followed from valuing truth over comfort. Living with indifference to circumstances followed from recognizing that external conditions do not determine internal states. Every aspect of his life was a deliberate expression of his philosophical principles. Can you say the same? Is your life a deliberate expression of consciously chosen principles, or are you drifting through, making choices based on habit, social pressure, and immediate desires without any coherent philosophy underlying it all? Most people live reactively rather than philosophically. They respond to circumstances rather than shaping circumstances according to values. They make decisions based on what seems easiest or most pleasant or most acceptable to others, rather than what aligns with their deepest convictions. And the result is a life that lacks coherence and direction, that feels like it is happening to them rather than being chosen by them. Diogenes would say, this is not really living at all. This is just existing, just going through motions, just filling time between birth and death without ever really inhabiting your life fully. To truly live requires choosing how to live based on principles that you have examined and found worthy, and then actually living that way, consistently, regardless of whether it is easy or popular or comfortable. This is difficult. This is much more difficult than studying philosophy in the conventional sense. Reading books about virtue is easy. Actually being virtuous is hard. Discussing theories of the good life is easy. Actually living a good life is hard. Understanding ideas intellectually is easy. Transforming those ideas into practice is hard. But Diogenes would say that only the hard version counts. Only the actual living according to principle constitutes real philosophy. Everything else is just preliminary, just preparation, just intellectual exercise that may be interesting but does not actually matter. There is a story that when someone complimented Diogenes on a philosophical lecture, he responded by asking whether the person had changed their behavior as a result of hearing it. When the person admitted they had not, Diogenes dismissed the lecture as worthless. What is the point of hearing philosophical truth if you do not let it transform you? What is the point of understanding something if understanding produces no effect? This exposes something uncomfortable about modern intellectual culture. We collect ideas like some people collect stamps. We pride ourselves on being well-read, on understanding complex theories, on being able to discuss sophisticated philosophical positions. But how often does any of this actually change how we live? How often does intellectual understanding translate into transformed practice? Rarely. Almost never for most people. We learn about Stoic acceptance of fate and then become anxious about things we cannot control. We study Buddhist teachings on non-attachment and then become obsessed with accumulating possessions. We read about Cynic simplicity and then continue our complicated, cluttered lives unchanged. The knowledge goes into our heads, but does not reach our hands and feet. It remains abstract, disconnected from the actual business of living. Diogenes would find this pathetic, not in a mean-spirited way, but as a genuine assessment. What a waste, to fill your mind with ideas that do not affect your life. What a waste, to understand principles without practicing them. What a waste to know what you should do and then not do it. This returns us to the question of what your philosophy actually is. The answer is not found in what you say or think. The answer is found in what you do, consistently, especially when no one is watching. Your real philosophy is your actual practice. And for most people, their actual practice reveals a philosophy they probably would not endorse if asked directly. The actual philosophy most people live by goes something like this. Pursue material comfort and social status. Avoid discomfort and disapproval. Follow the path of least resistance. Do what everyone else is doing. Don't ask too many questions. Don't rock the boat. Don't stand out too much. Keep your head down and get through each day. Accumulate enough stuff to feel secure. Maintain enough relationships to avoid loneliness. Achieve enough success to avoid being seen as a failure. And hope that somehow, eventually, all of this will add up to happiness and meaning. This is not a philosophy anyone would consciously choose. No one, if asked to design a philosophy of life from scratch, would arrive at this sad combination of conformity, consumption, and vague hope. And yet, this is what most people actually practice. This is what their choices reveal about their real values. Diogenes chose differently. He chose consciously, radically, completely, and he proved through the example of his life that a different way was possible. Not easy, not popular, not comfortable, but possible, and perhaps more fulfilling than the conventional alternative. As you begin to let sleep take you, consider what philosophy your life actually expresses. Not the philosophy you think you have, but the one your choices reveal. And consider whether that is the philosophy you would consciously choose if you were really free to choose. Because you are free to choose. You have always been free to choose. You just have not been choosing consciously. You've been letting circumstances and conditioning and social pressure make choices for you. Philosophy as a way of life means taking that power back. It means becoming conscious of your actual values and then living according to those values deliberately, courageously, consistently. It means closing the gap between what you profess and what you practice. It means becoming integrated, whole, authentic. It means finally actually living according to principle, rather than just talking about principles while living according to convenience. This is what Diogenes offers. Not a set of ideas to study, but an example to follow. Not a theory to understand, but a challenge to accept. The challenge is simple to state and difficult to achieve. Live according to what you actually believe is true and important. Stop performing. Stop pretending. Stop drifting. Choose a philosophy and live it fully. Become, in the deepest sense, what you actually are, rather than what others expect you to be. The barrel awaits. The lamp is lit. The only question is whether you are ready to step out of the shadows and into the harsh, liberating light of philosophical practice. Let us now turn to what might be Diogenes' most radical and most misunderstood teaching, his embrace of poverty, not as a misfortune to be endured, but as a choice to be celebrated. In a world where almost everyone is trying to escape poverty and gain wealth, where economic success is considered one of the primary markers of a life well lived, Diogenes insisted that poverty was actually superior to wealth. Not marginally better in some abstract spiritual sense, but concretely, practically, obviously better for human flourishing and happiness. This is not a popular message today, and it was not popular then. People want to hear that wealth is fine, as long as you do not become attached to it. That money is neutral and can be used for good or evil. That material comfort is compatible with virtue and wisdom. They do not want to hear that wealth itself is corrupting, that possessions are burdens, that having more usually makes you worse off rather than better off. But this is exactly what Diogenes claimed, and he had good reasons for claiming it. Reasons that make sense if you're willing to look honestly at how wealth actually affects people, rather than how you would like to believe it affects people. First, possessions require maintenance. Everything you own demands attention, time, energy, and usually money. A house needs repairs, cleaning, furnishing, insuring, securing. A car needs maintenance, fuel, insurance, parking. Clothes need cleaning and storing and eventually replacing. Electronics need updating and protecting, and eventually upgrading. Every single thing you possess creates obligations and consumes resources. This is obvious once stated, but people rarely calculate the full cost of ownership. They see the initial purchase price, but not the ongoing maintenance costs. They consider what the possession will do for them, but not what they will have to do for the possession. They think about the benefits, but not the burdens. Diogenes saw this clearly. He recognized that every possession is a chain that binds you. It binds you to the place where it is stored. It binds you to the work needed to maintain it. It binds you to the worry about losing it. It binds you to the identity of being someone who owns that kind of thing. The more you own, the more bound you are. The wealthier you become, the less free you are. This seems paradoxical because we usually think of wealth as providing freedom, and in some trivial sense it does. Wealth gives you options. It lets you go places and do things that would not be possible without money. But this is freedom of movement, not freedom of being. It is the freedom to go anywhere while remaining fundamentally trapped by your possessions and obligations. Real freedom, the kind Diogenes valued, is freedom from need. It is not needing to go anywhere or do anything because you are complete and satisfied exactly where you are. It is not needing anything external to be happy because happiness comes from within. It is not depending on favorable circumstances because you've developed the capacity to flourish in any circumstances. Poverty develops this capacity in a way that wealth never can. When you have nothing, you discover what you actually need, which turns out to be far less than you thought. You discover resourcefulness, resilience, and independence. You learn to be satisfied with simple pleasures and to find happiness in things that cannot be bought. You develop strength and character that wealthy people, protected from hardship, never develop. This is why Diogenes called himself wealthy, not ironically or metaphorically, but literally. He was wealthy because he needed nothing. His poverty had made him rich in ways that material wealth never could. He'd achieved the only kind of wealth that actually matters, which is sufficiency. He had enough. And having enough meant he was free from the endless striving that traps people who always need more. Consider how much of your life is organized around money. You work to earn it. You worry about whether you have enough. You make decisions based on financial considerations rather than what you actually want to do. You sacrifice time, health, relationships, and peace of mind in pursuit of financial security that never quite seems secure enough. Money is supposed to be a tool, a means to an end. But for most people, it becomes the end itself, the organizing principle around which everything else revolves. Diogenes escaped this completely. He needed no money because he owned nothing that required money to maintain. He needed no income because he had no expenses. He needed no financial security because he had nothing to lose. He was completely and utterly free from the money economy that enslaves almost everyone else. Now, you are probably thinking that this is impossible in modern society. You have bills to pay, rent or mortgage, food to buy, insurance, utilities, all the costs of contemporary life. You cannot simply opt out of the money economy the way Diogenes did in ancient Athens, and Diogenes would say that this impossibility is largely self-created. Yes, some costs are unavoidable if you want to participate in modern society, but most of what you think you need, you actually do not need. You have been convinced you need it through advertising, social comparison, and cultural conditioning. But need and want are different things, and you are confusing them. Do you need a car, or do you just want the convenience and status it provides? Do you need a large living space, or have you just been taught that square footage indicates success? Do you need the latest technology, or do you just want to keep up with others? Do you need most of what fills your closets and storage spaces, or did you just accumulate things without thinking about whether they actually serve you? The gap between actual needs and perceived needs is enormous for most people, and this gap is where your freedom goes. Every unnecessary possession creates obligations. Every unnecessary expense requires income. Every unnecessary commitment to material standards requires work to maintain them. You have built a cage for yourself out of things you do not need, and then convinced yourself that the cage is necessary. Diogenes would encourage you to test your assumptions about necessity. What would happen if you gave away half your possessions? Would your life actually be worse, or would it be simpler and more free? What would happen if you moved to a smaller living space? Would you be less happy? Or would you have lower expenses and thus more freedom in how you spend your time? What would happen if you stopped buying new things for a year? Would you suffer? Or would you discover that you already have more than enough? These experiments are frightening because they threaten your identity and social position. You are what you own, in the eyes of society, and possibly in your own eyes. Reducing what you own means reducing what you are, or so you have been taught to believe. But Diogenes proved this belief was false. He owned nothing and was more fully himself than people who owned estates and had careers and had accumulated all the markers of success. His identity did not depend on possessions because he had developed an identity based on character, wisdom, and authentic selfhood. He was someone not because of what he owned, but because of who he was. This is profoundly threatening to a culture organized around consumption. If happiness and identity do not depend on possessions, then the entire economic system has a problem. People might stop buying things they do not need. They might stop working jobs they hate to pay for lifestyles they do not enjoy. They might step off the treadmill of production and consumption that keeps the whole system running. This is why voluntary poverty is always treated as pathological or irresponsible in capitalist societies. Not because it is actually bad for the people who practice it, but because it is bad for economic growth if too many people do it. Diogenes' poverty was political resistance as well as personal liberation. By refusing to participate in the accumulation game, he was refusing to be a cog in the economic machine. By demonstrating that happiness was possible without wealth, he was undermining one of the primary motivations that keeps people working and consuming. By living well on nothing, he was proving that the entire system was based on manufactured needs rather than genuine necessity. There is another dimension to this that is perhaps even more important. Wealth corrupts character in ways that poverty does not. This is not a moral judgment, but an observation about psychological effects. When you have wealth and status, you begin to believe that you deserve them. You begin to think you are special, superior, more important than those who have less. You develop expectations about how you should be treated. You lose empathy for people in different circumstances because you cannot imagine those circumstances or understand why people do not simply do what you did. Wealth also makes you dependent. You become dependent on the systems and relationships that maintain your wealth. You become risk-averse because you have something to lose. You become conservative because change threatens your position. You become defensive of the status quo because the status quo benefits you. You lose the capacity for radical honesty and independent thought because your material interests are now invested in certain narratives remaining unchallenged. Poverty, by contrast, preserves independence and honesty. When you have nothing to lose, you can say and do whatever you believe is right without worrying about consequences. When you do not depend on others for material support, you can treat everyone equally without calculation. When you have no investment in the current system, you can see its flaws clearly without defensiveness. Poverty is clarifying in a way that wealth never can be. This is why prophets, saints, and wisdom teachers throughout history have typically been poor or have voluntarily embraced poverty. Not because poverty is morally superior in some abstract sense, but because poverty removes the obstacles to wisdom and compassion that wealth creates. It is much easier to care about justice when you have nothing to lose from justice being implemented. It is much easier to be honest when honesty cannot cost you your position or possessions. It is much easier to love others when you are not calculating what they can do for you. Diogenes understood all of this. His poverty was not a sacrifice or an inconvenience. It was a strategic choice that enabled everything else about his philosophy. It freed his time for philosophy rather than for maintaining possessions. It freed his mind from worry about protecting what he owned. It freed his relationships from the calculations and power dynamics that wealth creates. It freed his speech from the need to protect his interests. It freed his entire existence from the burdens that come with ownership and status. And he was happier for it. This is the part that is hardest for most people to accept. Not that poverty has some theoretical advantages, but that someone who was actually poor was actually happier than wealthy people. This contradicts everything we are taught about the relationship between material circumstances and well-being. We are taught that more is better, that comfort brings happiness, that security creates peace of mind. Diogenes proved all of this wrong through the example of his life. He did not just tolerate his poverty, he celebrated it, he enjoyed it, he found it vastly preferable to wealth. When offered money or gifts, he refused them, not out of principle, but because he genuinely did not want them. He had discovered something that wealthy people never discover, that wanting nothing is better than having everything, that needing less brings more satisfaction than acquiring more, that the secret to wealth is not having everything you want, but wanting nothing you do not have. This is available to you even now, even in your circumstances. You cannot become as poor as Diogenes was without radical changes most people are not willing to make, but you can move in that direction. You can begin reducing what you own and discovering that you are no less happy with less. You can begin questioning your expenses and finding that many of them serve image rather than genuine need. You can begin simplifying and finding that simplicity brings relief rather than deprivation. And as you do this, you may discover what Diogenes discovered: that possession is a burden, that wealth is a trap, that poverty, voluntarily chosen and rightly understood, is actually a gift. The gift of having your time be your own, the gift of having nothing to defend or maintain, the gift of being able to walk away from anything at any time. The gift of discovering that your happiness does not depend on circumstances and never did. This is the gift that poverty offers. This is what Diogenes found in his barrel that wealthy people in their mansions never find. And it is still available, still waiting, for anyone brave enough to let go of everything they think they need and discover what they actually need, which is far less than you think, and far more valuable than anything you own. We must now gather the threads of what we have explored and see how Diogenes' philosophy addresses the fundamental questions that humans have always asked. What is the good life? What is virtue? What is happiness? How should we live? What really matters? These questions are eternal because they arise from the human condition itself. Every culture, every generation, every thinking person must grapple with them. And every culture, every generation, every thinking person arrives at different answers. Diogenes' answers were radical in his time and remain radical today. They challenge almost everything that conventional wisdom teaches about how to live well. But they have the advantage of being tested against reality through the lived example of someone who actually practiced what he preached. This gives his answers a weight and credibility that purely theoretical philosophies lack. What is the good life? For most people, the good life involves some combination of comfort, security, success, pleasant experiences, good relationships, and social approval. We imagine that if we could just get the circumstances right, if we could just arrange our external conditions optimally, then we would be happy and fulfilled. Diogenes said this is completely backward. The good life has almost nothing to do with external circumstances. It has everything to do with internal states. Specifically, it requires living according to nature, being virtuous, and achieving self-sufficiency. These are internal achievements that can be realized in any circumstances, even in a barrel, even in poverty, even without social approval or conventional success. Living according to nature means following your genuine needs and inclinations, rather than artificial desires created by culture and conditioning. It means treating your body as an animal body with animal needs, rather than trying to transcend or deny your physical nature. It means being honest about what you actually are, which is a biological organism with certain requirements for survival and flourishing, rather than pretending to be a pure rational mind temporarily trapped in meat. Being virtuous means living according to principles of honesty, courage, wisdom, and self-control. But these virtues are not about conforming to social expectations. They are about conforming to your own highest understanding of what is right and true. Virtue is authenticity plus wisdom. It is being genuinely yourself while also being rational and ethical in how you exercise that authenticity. Achieving self-sufficiency means developing the capacity to be happy regardless of circumstances. It means not depending on external goods, other people's approval, or favorable situations for your well-being. It means having everything you need within yourself so that changes in fortune, however dramatic, cannot fundamentally disturb your equanimity and contentment. This is the good life as Diogenes understood it. And notice what is not required. You do not need wealth, status, power, property, career success, social prominence, or any of the things that people ordinarily pursue as markers of the good life. Those things are not just unnecessary for human flourishing, they are often obstacles to it. This leads to the next question. What is happiness? We tend to think of happiness as a feeling, specifically a pleasant feeling that we experience when things are going well. We are happy when we get what we want, when we experience pleasure, when circumstances are favorable. And we are unhappy when we do not get what we want, when we experience pain, when circumstances are difficult. Diogenes would say that this is a shallow and unstable form of happiness that keeps you dependent on external conditions you cannot control. True happiness, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, is not a feeling, but a state of being. It is flourishing, thriving, living well in the deepest sense. And it is available regardless of circumstances because it comes from within. True happiness requires three things. First, living according to your nature and values. Second, exercising virtue and wisdom. Third, achieving independence from external conditions. When you have these three things, you are happy in a way that cannot be taken from you. Circumstances may change, bringing pleasure or pain, comfort or difficulty. But your fundamental well-being remains stable because it is based on internal factors you control rather than external factors you do not control. This is why Diogenes could be happy in a barrel while people in palaces were miserable. His happiness did not depend on comfort or circumstances. It came from living exactly as he chose to live, according to principles he had examined and found true. No one could take this away from him. No change in fortune could disturb it. He was happy in the deepest sense because he was free and authentic and virtuous. Everything else was irrelevant. This suggests an answer to the question of how we should live. We should live simply, honestly, authentically, and in accordance with our nature. We should strip away everything that is not essential and discover what remains. We should give up the quest for things that cannot satisfy us and develop capacities that provide lasting fulfillment. We should stop performing for others and start being ourselves. We should stop accumulating and start simplifying. We should stop seeking approval and start seeking truth. This is easier said than done because it requires going against almost every message that culture sends. You have been taught that more is better, that security comes from accumulation, that happiness depends on circumstances, that success means impressing others. Diogenes says all of this is wrong. Less is better. Security comes from independence. Happiness comes from within. Success means living according to your own values rather than others' expectations. Can you do this? Can you actually live this way? Not in some distant future when circumstances are different, but now, with things as they are. This is the test of whether you really understand Diogenes' philosophy or whether it remains just an interesting intellectual exercise. Because here is what makes Diogenes permanently relevant. He is not offering a philosophy that requires perfect conditions to practice. He is not saying that you can be free and happy if only society were different, or if only you had different resources, or if only other people would leave you alone. He's saying you can be free and happy right now by choosing differently, by wanting less, by needing nothing, by being shameless about who you are, by living according to principles you have consciously chosen. The barriers are not external, they are internal. You are not trapped by circumstances. You are trapped by your own desires, fears, and conditioning. You are not prevented from being free by anything outside yourself. You prevent yourself from being free by clinging to things that bind you and caring about judgments that should not matter. This is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means freedom is always available. Terrifying because it means you have no excuses. You cannot blame your circumstances, your upbringing, your culture, your obligations. If you are not free, it is because you are choosing not to be free, and that is a hard truth to face. But facing hard truths is what philosophy demands. Philosophy is not about comfort or reassurance. It is about honestly examining reality and living according to what you discover. And what Diogenes discovered, what his entire life demonstrated, is that most of what people think they need is actually holding them back. Most of what people think will make them happy will actually make them miserable. Most of what people pursue as success is actually failure to live authentically. As you drift now towards sleep, let these questions settle into your mind. What do you actually need? What would happen if you needed less? What are you afraid of losing that you do not actually need? What judgments are you afraid of from people whose opinions should not matter? What performances are you maintaining that serve others rather than yourself? What would your life look like if you stripped away everything that is not essential and lived with complete honesty and simplicity? These are not idle questions. These are the questions that determine whether you live freely or spend your life in comfortable captivity. Diogenes answered them one way and proved through his life that his answers worked. He was free. He was authentic. He was authentic. He lived exactly as he chose to live, according to values he had consciously adopted, without compromise or apology. You can do the same. Not by becoming exactly like Diogenes, which would just be another performance, but by taking seriously the questions he asked and the principles he demonstrated. By examining your own life with the same radical honesty he applied to his. By being willing to let go of what does not serve you, even if everyone else thinks you are crazy. By valuing freedom and authenticity more than you value comfort and approval. The lamp is still lit. The search continues. But perhaps now you understand what Diogenes was really searching for. He was not searching for perfect people. He was searching for authentic people. For people who had stopped performing and started being. For people who had faced the truth about what matters and what does not. For people who had chosen freedom over security, authenticity over approval, simplicity over complexity. He is still searching. And the question that should keep you awake, or perhaps the question that should finally let you sleep in peace, is whether he would find what he was looking for if he looked at you. Are you the person the lamp is seeking? Or are you still hiding in the shadows of performance and pretense, hoping not to be found? The answer is up to you. It has always been up to you, and it always will be. That is both the burden and the gift of human freedom. You cannot escape the choice. You can only make it consciously or unconsciously, courageously or fearfully, authentically or performatively. Diogenes chose consciously, courageously, authentically. And he invites you to do the same. Not by living in a barrel, though you could if you wanted to, but by living according to principles you've examined and found true. By being honest about what matters to you. By simplifying until only the essential remains. By needing nothing, fearing nothing, hiding nothing. This is the way to freedom. This is the way to happiness. This is the way to a life that is genuinely your own, rather than a performance directed by others. The way is open. The path is clear. The only question is whether you have the courage to walk it. And with that question hanging in the space between wakefulness and sleep, perhaps you can finally rest. Because whatever answer you give, whether you choose freedom or continue in comfortable captivity, at least now you are choosing consciously. At least now you know that it is a choice. At least now you cannot pretend that you have no options, that circumstances have trapped you, that this is just how life has to be. Diogenes showed you otherwise. He lived otherwise. He proved otherwise through decades of lived example. The lamp glows in the darkness, still searching, still waiting. And somewhere, in a barrel or in a palace, someone is making the same choice you are making right now. The choice between authentic freedom and comfortable slavery, between living and performing, between being and seeming. Choose well, or do not choose at all and let the choice be made for you. But know that even not choosing is a choice. Even drifting is a decision. Even staying where you are is moving in a direction, just not one you selected consciously. The beggar in the barrel has nothing to offer you but truth. He has no comfort to provide, no easy answers to give, no reassurance that everything will be fine if you just keep doing what you are doing. He only has the lamp, the question, and the lived example of a life that was completely, utterly, radically free. That will have to be enough, because that is all there is. And perhaps, if you are honest with yourself, you will realize it is everything you actually needed all along.